They were white, and they were slaves. The Untold History of the Enslavement of Whites in Early America. Michael A. Hoffman II. Introduction. They were of two sorts. First, such as were brought over by masters of ships to be sold as servants. Such as we call them, my dear, says she, but they are more properly called slaves. Daniel Defoe, Moll Flanders. This is a history of white people that has never been told in any coherent form, largely because most modern historians have, for reasons of politics or psychology, refused to recognize white slaves in early America as just that. Today, not a tear is shed for the sufferings of millions of our own enslaved forefathers. 200 years of white slavery in America have been almost completely obliterated from the collective memory of the American people, who wants to be reminded that half, perhaps as many as thirds, of the original American colonists came here, not of their own free will, but kidnapped, shanghaied, impressed, duped, beguiled, and yes, in chains. We tend to gloss over it. We'd prefer to forget the whole sorry chapter. A correct understanding of the authentic history of the enslavement of whites in America could have profound consequences for the future of the races. We cannot be sure that the position of the earliest Africans differed markedly from that of the white indentured servants. The debate has considerable significance for the interpretation of race relations in American history. Eugene D. Genovese, Roll, Jordan Roll, The World the Slaves Made, p. 31. Most of the books on white labor in early America are titled with words like white indentured servitude, white bondservants, white servants, etc. It is interesting that white people who were bound to a condition of what became in many cases permanent chattel slavery unto death are not referred to as slaves by establishment academics. With the massive concentration of educational and media resources on the Negro experience of slavery, the unspoken assumption has been that only blacks have been enslaved to any degree or magnitude worthy of study or memorial. The historical record reveals that this is not the case, however. White people have been sold as slaves for centuries. White slavery in ancient medieval Europe. Among the ancient Greeks, despite their tradition of democracy, the enslavement of fellow whites, even fellow Greeks, was the order of the day. Aristotle considered white slaves as things. The Romans also had no compunctions against enslaving whites, who they too termed a thing, res. In his agricultural writings, the 1st century BC Roman philosopher Varro labeled white slaves as nothing more than tools that happen to have voices, instrumenti vocale. Cato the Elder, discoursing on plantation management, proposed that white slaves, when old or ill, should be discarded along with worn-out farm implements. Julius Caesar enslaved as many as 1 million whites from Gaul, some of whom were sold to the slave dealers who followed his victorious legions. William D. Phillips, Jr. Slavery from Roman times to the early transatlantic trade, p. In AD 319, the Christian emperor of Rome, Constantine, ruled that if an owner whipped his white slave to death, he should not stand in any criminal accusation if the slave dies, and all statutes of limitations and legal interpretations are hereby set aside. The Romans enslaved thousands of the early white inhabitants of Great Britain, who were known as Angles, from which we derive the term Anglo-Saxon as a description of the English race. In the 6th century, Pope Gregory the first witnessed blonde-haired, blue-eyed English boys awaiting sale in a slave market in Rome. Inquiring of their origin, the Pope was told they were Angles. Gregory replied, "Non Angli, sed Angeli, not Angles, but angels." When the Franks conquered the Visigoths in southern Gaul, huge numbers of whites entered the slave markets. After Charlemagne's conquest of Saxony, during which many pagan Saxons were enslaved, he set up a network of parish churches. To provide for the maintenance of the priest and the church, those living in the parish were to donate a house and land, as well as a male and female Saxon slave to the church for every 120 people in the parish. William Phillips, p. 52. Arabs and the traffic in white slaves. The trade in white slaves was one of the few sources of foreign exchange for Western European powers in a period when the East produced the goods that Europeans could not procure elsewhere. The sale of white slaves to Asia and Africa was one of the few sources of gold for European treasuries. From the 8th to the 11th century, France was a major transfer point for white slaves to the Muslim world, with Rouen being the center for the selling of Irish and Flemish slaves. At the same time that France was a transfer point for slaves to the Muslim world, Italy was occupying much the same position. Venetians were selling slaves and timber across the Mediterranean. The slaves were usually slaves brought across the Alps. The Venetians were the earliest successful Italian sea traders, and because profits on slave trade with the Muslims were lucrative, they resisted efforts to stop them. In return for their exports of timber, iron, and white slaves, they brought in Oriental luxury products, mainly fine cloths. William Phillips, pp. 62-63. The stereotype from establishment consensus history is of the Muslim slaver herding chained blacks through the desert. In fact, for 700 years, until the fall of Muslim Spain, those being herded were first and foremost overwhelmingly white. Before the 10th century, the Muslims generally bought Christian Europeans as slaves. By the 10th century, Slavs became the most numerous imported group during the late Middle Ages. Until the fall of Granada in the late 15th century, most slaves of the Muslims were Christians from the northern kingdoms. William Phillips, p. 69. In the vast lands of the Eastern European steppes from the 8th to the 12th century, there was a well-developed slaving network. Slavs and Finns, called Sakaliba, slaves, indiscriminately by the Muslims, entered the Muslim world by these Caspian and Black Sea routes. The fate of the hundreds of thousands of white slaves sold to the Arabs was described in one Spanish text as atrocissima et ferocissima, most atrocious and harsh. The men were worked to death as galley slaves. The women, girls, and boys were used as prostitutes. White males had their genitals mutilated in castration attempts, bloody procedures of incredible brutality, which most of the white men who were forced to submit did not survive. Dodging from the high prices white eunuchs commanded throughout the Middle Eastern slave markets. Escape from North Africa and the Middle East was almost impossible, and those white slaves who were caught trying to flee were punished by having their noses and ears cut off, or worse. Early Muslim texts provide insights into the extent to which the Arabs identified Europeans with slavery, classified white slaves as animals, and even produced learned racist disquisitions on the supposed merits of emasculated East European slaves. In his 9th century treatise on beasts, The Book of Animals, the Muslim scholar Jahiz writes, "Another change which overcomes the eunuch, of two slaves of Slavic race who are twins, one castrated and the other not, the eunuch becomes more disposed toward service, wiser, more able, and apt for various problems of manual labor. All these qualities you find only in the castrated one. On the other hand, his brother continues to have the same native torpor, the same lack of natural talent, the same imbecility common to slaves, and incapacity for learning a foreign language." Charles Verlinden, The Slave in Medieval Europe, Vol. 1, p. 213. Whites were also enslaved in Russia, and I do not refer here to serfdom, which was a later development. Knowledge of the existence of slavery in early modern Russia is not widespread. Many people know of the existence of serfdom and confuse the two. Richard Helly, Slavery in Russia, 14,501,725, pxv. The white Russian Muscovites were enslaved both by northern European raiders as well as massive slave-catching operations launched by the Mongols and the Ottoman Empire. Russians also enslaved each other to such an extent that in 1571, an official slave chancellery was established which formally codified white slavery as a Russian institution. Heli, p. 118. Viking slavers. In the 9th century, the Vikings sold tens of thousands of whites to the Arabs of Spain. According to Michael Wood's book, In Search of the Dark Ages, an Arab traveler of the time who came to Spain remarked on the great numbers of European slaves in harems and in the militia. The palace of the Emir of Cordoba in particular had many white girls. Of these unfortunate people, the Vikings were undoubtedly a major source of supply. The Arabs in Spain saw the long-term potential of this trade, and as early as the 842nd sent a diplomatic mission to Scandinavia to put it on an organized basis. The most westerly component of the early medieval slave trade in Europe was the British Isles. In the 11th century, the Vikings were active slave traders in Ireland. From Ireland, the Vikings took the slaves to be sold in Muslim Spain and Scandinavia, and even to be transported into Russia. Some may have been taken as far as Constantinople and the Muslim Middle East. William Phillips, p. 63. The Norwegian slave trader was an important enough figure to appear in the 12th century tale of Tristan. Icelandic literature also provides numerous references to raiding in Ireland as a source for slaves. Norwegian Vikings made slave raids not only against the Irish and Scots, who are often called Irish in Norse sources, but also against Norse settlers in Ireland or the Scottish Isles, or even in Norway itself. Slave trading was a major commercial activity of the Viking Age. Ruth Mazo Kara's Slavery and Society in Medieval Scandinavia, p. 49. The children of white slaves in Iceland were routinely murdered en masse, Karas, p. 52. White slavery in early America. David Breon Davis, writing in the New York Review of Books, October 11, 1990, p. 37 states, as late as the 14th and 15th centuries, continuing shipments of white slaves, some of them Christians, flowed from the booming slave markets on the northern Black Sea coast into Italy, Spain, Egypt, and the Mediterranean islands. From Barbados to Virginia, colonists showed few scruples about reducing their less fortunate countrymen to a status little different from that of chattel slaves. The prevalence and suffering of white slaves, serfs, and indentured servants in the early modern period suggests that there was nothing inevitable about limiting plantation slavery to people of African origin. L. Rushims, in the Sources of Racial Thought in Colonial America, states that the slave trade worked in both directions, with white merchandise as well as black. Journal of Negro History, No. 52, pp. 251-273. In 1659, the English Parliament debated the practice of selling British whites into slavery in the New World. In the debate, the whites were referred to not as indentured servants, but as slaves whose enslavement threatened the liberties of all Englishmen. Thomas Burton, Parliamentary Diary, 165,659, vol. 4, pp. 253-274. Foster R. Dulles, in Labor in America, quotes an early document describing white children in colonial servitude as crying and mourning for redemption from their slavery. Dr. Hilary M. McD. Beckles of the University of Hull, England, writes regarding white slave labor, indenture contracts were alienable, the ownership of which could easily be transferred. Like that of any other commodity, as with slaves, ownership changed without their participation in the dialogue concerning transfer. Beckles refers to indentured servitude as white proto-slavery, The Americas, vol. 41, no. 2, p. 21. In the Calendar of State Papers, Colonial Series, America and West Indies of 1701, we read of a protest over the encouragement to the spiriting away of Englishmen without their consent and selling them for slaves, which had been a practice very frequent and known by the name of kidnapping. Emphasis added, in the British West Indies, plantation slavery was instituted as early as 1627. In Barbados by the 1640s, there were an estimated 25,000 slaves, of whom 21,700 were white. Some observations on the island of Barbados, Calendar of State Papers, Colonial Series, p. 528. It is worth noting that while white slaves were worked to death in Barbados, there were Caribbean Indians brought from Guyana to help propagate native foodstuffs who were well treated and received as free persons by the wealthy planters. Of the fact that the wealth of Barbados was founded on the backs of white slave labor, there can be no doubt. White slave laborers from Britain and Ireland were the mainstay of the sugar colony. Until the mid-1640s, there were few blacks in Barbados. George Downing wrote to John Winthrop, the colonial governor of Massachusetts in 1645, that planters who wanted to make a fortune in the British West Indies must procure white slave labor out of England if they wanted to succeed. Elizabeth Donnan, Documents Illustrative of the History of the Slave Trade to America, pp. 125–126. White indentured servants were employed and treated, incidentally, exactly like slaves. Morley I. Erst, The British West Indies, p. 19. The many gradations of unfreedom among whites made it difficult to draw fast lines between any idealized free white worker and a pitied or scorned servile black worker. In labor-short 17th and 18th century America, the work of slaves and that of white servants were virtually interchangeable in most areas. David R. Roediger, The Wages of Whiteness, Race and the Making of the American Working Class, p. 25. In the Massachusetts Court of Assistants, whose records date to 1633, we find a 1638 description of a white man, one Giles player, as having been delivered up for a slave. The Englishman William Edis, after observing white slaves in America in the 1770s, wrote, "Generally speaking, they groaned beneath a worse than Egyptian bondage." Governor Sharp of the Maryland colony compared the property interest of the planters in their white slaves with the estate of an English farmer consisting of a multitude of cattle. The Quackwalker case in Massachusetts in 1783, which ruled that slavery was contrary to the state constitution, was applied equally to blacks and whites in Massachusetts. Patrick F. Moranan, in his historical sketch of the persecution suffered by the Catholics of Ireland, refers to the transportation of the Irish to the colonies as the slave trade, pp. 343–346. The disciplinary and revenue laws of early Virginia did not discriminate Negroes in bondage from whites in bondage. William Henning, Statutes at Large of Virginia, Vol. I, pp. 174, 198, 200, 243, 306. For records of wills in which lands, goods, chattels, cattle, monies, Negroes, English servants, horses, sheep, and household stuff were all sold together, see the Lancaster County Records in Virginia Colonial Abstracts. Beverly Fleet, editor. Lay historian Colonel A.B. Ellis, writing in the British newspaper Argosy, few, but readers of old colonial state papers and records are aware that between the years 1649–1690 a lively trade was carried on between England and the plantations, as the colonies were then called, in political prisoners, where they were sold by auction to the colonists for various terms of years, sometimes for life as slaves. Sir George Sandys's 1618 plan for Virginia referred to bound whites assigned to the Treasurer's office to belong to said office forever. The service of whites bound to Berkeley's 100 was white slavery and bondage in British colonial America cannot be fully understood without also understanding how British whites came to be dehumanized in their homeland across the sea. Deemed perpetual. Lewis Cecil Gray, History of Agriculture in the Southern United States to 1860, Vol. I, pp. 306.